Are humans basically able to create our own reality through our thoughts?
Yes, but not in the way that people normally think. This is not generally taught in textbooks. The writings of most of the founders of quantum mechanics said that consciousness is primary. So we're studying aspects of the physical world, but ultimately it's coming out of mind. For a quantum object, it has like all properties that are possible until you look at it, and then suddenly it so-called collapses into the thing that you measured. We have the capacity through our intention to shape what happens around us in the physical world.
What are those 6 things that are needed for somebody to, and what is the outcome, I suppose? 6 elements to do what? To achieve what?
To do anything that you want. So intention is very important. Belief is very important.
Can you explain what the observer effect is, just for like a lay person?
So that's where things become interesting.
There's been a recent resurgence of popularity about quantum mechanics, which has allowed physicists from all around the world to come forth with their data and their statistics of the tests that they've run to actually show that we might actually be able to control our reality, or at least influence our reality through our mind, through our consciousness. My guest today, Dr. Dean Radin, is one of those pioneers in the field of parapsychology research. He has been studying telepathy, clairvoyance, psychokinesis, the power of intention for years, and actually has data to back up his hypotheses. I'm personally somebody who, while I want to believe in things, I need a little bit more than that, because there's a lot of things out there that's kind of wooey and a little bit too much. This conversation takes all of that stuff, law of attraction, manifestation, all that, and grounds it into real scientific data. We get into all the ways that we might be able to affect our consciousness and our realities. Let's get into it. Okay, so let's just dive right into it. So are humans basically able to create our own reality through our thoughts, in your opinion, based off the research that you've done?
Well, yes, but perhaps not in the way that people normally think. That when we're talking essentially about manifestation, psychic phenomena, that sort of thing. So we have very high confidence from a scientific perspective that those things exist. They're not like what you see in the movies, and it's not like what you read in fiction. So I would need to separate existence versus the magnitude of an effect. So yes, we have the capacity through our intention to shape what happens around us in the physical world. And we also have the capacity through things like clairvoyance and precognition to anticipate what's happening and arrange for ourselves to be in a place that is favorable to the outcomes that we want, to a small degree.
To a small degree. Can that be... So you mentioned intention. What role does intention play on the outcomes of our lives? For example, I've talked to some people like Thomas Campbell, and he's very big on intention in that it almost dictates, not completely the outcome, but it's almost the supercharge that will allow an outcome to unfold potentially.
Yeah, intention is very important. Also, belief is very important. Focus of attention is very important. Motivation is important. There's 5 or 6 different characteristics, all of which are compound to make an outcome more likely to occur. And of course, then there's another one, which is like all of those factors are things that anybody can do. The one that people can't do so well is that they need to be born with talent. So if you have a lot of talent in something, you can be very good at it very quickly. And that goes for any kind of talent. The same is true in this domain. Some people simply have a talent to make things happen. And they're not doing anything any better than anybody else, other than they have this special capacity.
What are those 6 things that are needed for somebody to, and what is the outcome, I suppose? 6 elements to do what? To achieve what? You talk about this a lot in your book.
To do anything that you want. So the likelihood that something is going to happen is related to the probability that it would occur by chance. So if somebody comes to me and says, can I intend to win the lottery? So my response is, well, what are the odds of winning the lottery by chance? If the answer is 300 million to 1, with intention and focus and motivation and all these other things, maybe you could reduce the odds to as low as 30 million to 1. That's 10 times better than chance. But you're not going to reduce it down to 1 to 1. Even with talent, that would be very, very difficult. So that's one thing. So it's related to the probability of something happening by chance. And you can push the chance essentially in your favor. So you can think about this as there's dumb luck and there's smart luck. So through your intention, you can create a kind of a smart luck. You can be luckier than chance. The other thing is it depends on the nature of what it is that you want. So if what you wanted involves lots of other people making decisions, that's way difficult because now you're pushing against their intentions too, which among other things is considered black magic within the magical traditions. You're not supposed to do that because it's overriding somebody else's free will. But nevertheless, if you want to find a missing $10 bill, that is way easier than wanting somebody to just randomly give you a $10 bill. You see, the difference in one case is you're influencing somebody else's behavior. In the other case, you're finding something that was just missing, lost.
Yeah, so you're it's this ability to focus our intent that allows the outcome to get potentially closer to the outcome that we desire. When we're trying to manipulate other people's lives, and the more people we involve, the more intentions are involved, and that's when things get a little bit muddier. Intention, does it have to be a positive intention in your experience with the research? Like, does it have to be a good thing that you're looking for?
It doesn't. It looks as though these abilities are simply part of the fabric of reality. And so the direction of what you wish is independent of the outcome. But of course, it depends on yourself. If you're wishing for something that internally you're thinking maybe that's not such a great thing, well, that'll get into the way. It'll get in the way. If you're wishing for somebody else to become healthy who might be ill, and you don't have the permission to wish for that, that may not work very well for either person. So again, you want to be careful about what you're wishing for, because A, it might come true, and B, you might accidentally be overriding somebody else's free will. Mm-hmm. So this comes out of this long tradition in the magical traditions of spell casting. What is it that you want? What are the consequences of actually getting it? And so we're talking here about magic as though I'm a sorcerer or something, and I'm not. I'm a scientist. And so the conclusions that I've reached about the nature of magic is, first of all, it exists. And again, it's not like what you see in the movies. But second, it's based on evidence from 150 years of scientific tests of psychic phenomena. Because what we currently call psychic effects, things like clairvoyance and psychokinetics and so on, those are exactly the same as what magicians would call magic. And the only reason that the words are different is because they come out of different cultures and different points in history. But the phenomena are the same kinds of phenomena.
I think that's what's so valuable about your book is that you're taking what has traditionally been considered a very woo-woo topic, and you start out the whole thing with the history of like magic and why things have been taboo, and really the understanding as to why we don't really openly talk about this kind of information anymore, or in our culture it's shifted. And then you take it through various studies that you've done that are going into, studying intention and practicing how that might work, and like double blind tests to see what the results are. I think one of the things that I was really curious about was this observer effect, which has kind of caught more attention now that quantum has caught a little bit more attention. So can you explain what the observer effect is, just for like a lay person?
Well, it was first discovered within physics, at least. It's been known in other disciplines as well. But in physics, there are two things that were found to be very strange about quantum mechanics. They're still called weird, just because they're they don't fit everyday experience very
It's
well.
weird.
So in classical physics, which is kind of a refinement of common sense, if you observe a system, it doesn't change. And so the way this is described by Einstein and others is when you look at the moon, it's still there. Like if you're looking at the moon, it's there. If you look away, do you think it's still there? Well, yeah. I mean, our common experience says just because I'm not looking at something doesn't mean it goes away. In quantum mechanics, it's not quite the same, though. In quantum mechanics, when you observe a quanta, very typically, not always, but typically very small particles like electrons and photons and things like that, when you look at it, its properties are different than if you don't look at it. So that's what's called the observer effect. And so the way this is demonstrated in Physics 101 is typically with a double slit optical system, where you shine photons that go through two tiny little slits, and then they pass through the slits and they end up on a screen or a camera. And the point is, if you don't know which of the two slits that the photon goes through, and you send a bunch of them through there, you will end up with a certain kind of interference pattern, which looks like alternating bands of light and dark. But if you do know, if you look carefully, either with an instrument or as we're showing in our experiments, even with your mind, if you do know which of the two slits the photon goes through, it means you've gained something about the properties of the photon itself. And one of the experiments that I'm doing with this kind of phenomenon, it's called you gain position localization. Like you actually know where the photon is. Just knowing that is sufficient to cause it to behave differently than if you didn't know where it was precisely. And so that's what's called the observer effect. It's also part of what's called the quantum measurement problem, which has to do with when you measure a quantum system, its properties. It's not exactly that they'll change. It's more like before you measure something, it has a huge array of possible properties. Unlike in the everyday world, when you look at something, the properties are very clear. It has a certain weight, a certain shape, a certain size. All of those are properties of an object. For a quantum object, it has like all properties that are possible until you look at it, which also means until you measure it. And then suddenly it so-called collapses into the thing that you measured. So this is, again, one of the very strange things about quantum mechanics is that in the world, everywhere around us are quantum phenomena, and they don't have properties in the same way that classical larger objects have properties until we look at it. So,
Yeah, so it's like,
and by the way, nobody really understands how that is. We don't know why the act of gaining information from the system by measuring it, we don't know why that causes it to change. There are various theories, but I don't think anybody actually knows.
well, yeah, this is all really, I would say, relatively new research. Maybe not theories and stuff, right? Like it's been around, but what the guy who was levitating in 1603, I think it was, that stuff has been kind of happening. But I think now it's become more okay to study it and talk about it publicly.
No, quantum mechanics is now a century old, developed in about 100 years ago.
Sure, but the conversations about this, well, like I guess what I'm saying is the research hasn't really been happening with modern day science until what, the last 50 years?
No, almost from the beginning.
Really?
So
Okay.
most of the founders were already recognizing that the strangeness of quantum mechanics and the quantum measurement problem, which is this issue of why do quanta change when you measure it, that was recognized very early on, at least 80 years ago. What has changed is that as the idea of quantum mechanics developed around the 1960s or so, there was always this notion that there were things like entanglement, that particles were connected even though they didn't appear to be connected. It took years, it took 40 years or so before somebody figured out a way of testing if that was actually true. That was John Bell. And it took another 20 years for somebody to actually do the experiment. It took another 20 or 30 years before 3 people got the Nobel Prize a couple of years ago for demonstrating experimentally that entanglement is actually a real thing. So in quantum mechanics, non-local connections are actually real. So it did take 80 years, maybe 90 years, until experiments caught up to what the theory was predicting. I think what you're referring to is experiments of the type that my colleagues and I have been doing to see, is it really true that your mind alone can gain information from quantum systems and cause them to behave differently? That is relatively new.
Yeah. Okay. That's relatively new. Can you explain? I don't know if you go too much into the entanglement stuff specifically, but what is it what is happening there to your knowledge? What's going on that makes that happen?
Nobody knows what's going on. There are various interpretations of what you can measure. You can buy a tabletop apparatus now to create entangled photons. So it's in its essence, you take a photon, like a high energy photon, like a blue photon, you send it through a certain kind of apparatus, and it splits into two red photons, which are lower energy. And then you send one of those red photons through something like a polarizer, which will change the polarization of the photon. And you measure what the polarization is of the other photon. Because once they split, in a classical sense, they're two photons now. They're two separate things. An entangled pair will show that you can twiddle one with polarization and lots of other methods, and the other one will always respond in the opposite way. It'll show an opposite property. Well, you don't see that in a classical system unless the two actually are coming out of a common source and retaining the same underlying properties. But even if that were true, and it was a classical system, if I change one of them, the other one's not going to change. I could care less what I did to its partner because its partner is way off somewhere else by now. But entangled pairs, it does matter. And so the theory said that once we have the entangled pair, they literally could be anywhere, opposite sides of the universe, and I could twiddle one and the other one will respond. This doesn't mean that there's some kind of superluminal connection. They're not talking to each other in a classical way, but they are still connected in some way. So it is the nature of that connection, which is now being used for things like quantum communication and quantum computing, and people are using it, but the interpretation of exactly what that means is still not entirely clear.
Okay. What role do you think the brain plays in all of this intentions and thoughts and observing, a proton or electron or whatever? Like what do we, from your work, believe the brain is as important as we've always thought it's been in modern day, or does this put that into question?
I like my brain. I think a brain is a good thing. It's good to have a good brain, a working brain.
It's good.
The question is, from a neuroscience perspective, the assumption has been that consciousness, your sense of self-awareness and subjectivity and nature of experience, is generated by the brain. And that's where we find books with titles like "You Are Your Brain." And this is sort of the prevailing idea now within the neurosciences, and it has been for many years, that your subjective self-awareness is generated by the brain as a very complex recursive object doing all kinds of computation, that your sense of awareness, your experience is brain-centric. What the phenomena that we're talking about, whether it's psychic or magical, says that that's probably true to a large extent, but it's not entirely true. So that's where things become interesting. Because the problem in the neurosciences is called the hard problem. The way that we observe things from the outside, looking at the way the brain works, if you bite into a lemon, we can trace from the outside, looking at what's going on in the neurons and everything, all kinds of activity happens. We can measure your EEG, we can put you on a functional MRI, and we can see that your brain responds differently if you're biting into a lemon versus biting a piece of chocolate or something like that. That doesn't tell us anything about what is it like on the inside when you bite one thing versus the other. They taste completely differently. You have a different reaction to it. That's subjective. So we don't know how a physical objective system, whether it's a brain or a computer or anything else, how is it that has an internal life? We don't know. That's an outstanding problem, unsolved in the neurosciences. And so some people expect that we will eventually figure it out. That typically it's that you have a system like the brain that's very complicated, has a huge number of recursive circuits and it's electrochemical and all the rest, that somehow that system will eventually get an internal self. If you expand that idea, in essence, you can say, well, if I took a bunch of tin cans and I attached them by strings, but it was really complicated, that this tin can string structure would eventually develop some sort of internal sense of self. Well, it doesn't seem very likely, but that's essentially what today's models say. That sufficient complexity will eventually give rise to an internal sense of self, consciousness. There's all kinds of reasons why that's almost certainly not true. So some of it has to do with psychic experience, with magical experience, which are basically the same thing, but also with lots of other experiences like near-death experience, out-of-body experience, terminal lucidity, and lots of other things suggesting that the way that we experience reality as human beings in our normal state is pretty heavily dependent on the brain, for sure. You can start messing with the brain with drugs and surgery and stuff, and your experience will be very different. But that is different than saying, well, what's the source of this internal experience in the first place? Your sense of awareness. Is that generated by the brain or is it something else? These phenomena suggest it is something else. And so it's not a popular notion yet within science, although it is becoming much, much more serious. And a lot of thought leaders are taking it seriously because of the recognition that it's not only that we don't know how a brain could give rise to internal experience, but we don't know what it would be like to have an idea about how to do that. It's quite different to say that, well, I can guess that maybe you put A, B, and C together and you get a result. We don't even know that there are letters involved in the sequence. I mean, really, this is a major mystery. And so you have to look to alternative philosophies, alternative sets of assumptions about the nature of reality to begin to make sense of this. And scientists generally don't like to dive into philosophy, but there is a philosophy of science. And so if you step away from the current worldview, materialism is the name of that worldview, it turns out, I think, that the way that science has evolved into this materialistic idea is it will eventually be seen as a special case. Just like classical physics is a special case of the nature of reality, and quantum mechanics is a more comprehensive case, and the same with relativity. When you track science in almost every discipline, it starts out with an idea of this is the way things are. And then something comes along and says, well, that doesn't really capture it. It has to be, you have to expand our ideas a little bit and expand. And everything just keeps expanding, including physics and neuroscience and everything else. When you start expanding away from the materialism as something that explains everything, you do find that there's lots of other alternatives, one of which is called idealism, which is the idea that actually the thing that captures everything is consciousness first, and then physics is inside that somewhere. Actually, all the other disciplines are inside this larger sense that everything out there is ultimately made out of consciousness. So it turns out that that is the esoteric worldview. That's the world that magic has always lived in. And so from that point of view, if your worldview was that everything is ultimately consciousness, it's all about like universal awareness of some type, and that it's more primary than the physical world, well, now magic makes perfect sense. Well, of course, what you think is happening, it's manifesting because that's where it comes from in the first place. So science is not ready to become purely idealistic yet. But it's worth pointing out that almost all of the founders of quantum mechanics were idealists. That was their worldview. That's why when you look at the writings that they had, this is 100 years ago now, but the writings of most of the founders of quantum mechanics said that consciousness is primary. So we're studying aspects of the physical world, but ultimately it's coming out of mind. So again, this is not generally taught in textbooks, unless you happen to be a philosopher of science, but it's very well understood, and well, no, not so well understood. It's a well-known idea, and I think we're getting closer and closer to being able to test if that is actually true. That's primarily most of what my research is about, testing the idea that mind actually is primary.
So that basically, in other words, how I've heard it put is consciousness is fundamental, is what I keep hearing. So everything we are, everything we see, everything around us, everything is consciousness, is really the baseline. And then on top of that comes relativity, space-time, like whatever else frame that one could see their reality through. But it is all consciousness. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay. If you could say, while I know you don't have the answer, no one does, but what do you think consciousness is?
I think it's a little bit like a fabric. A fabric is made out of threads that are woven in two directions. So I think it's simply one of those threads. It is part of the fabric of reality. And so the other thread might be energy, might be material, might be something else. So this is one kind of model of reality with a big R, that it's woven from different kinds of threads, at least two different kinds. But that's only like every Tuesday and Thursday. I think that may be the answer. But then alternative Wednesdays, I'm thinking, actually, idealism is actually an easier way of understanding it. We're always trying to look for a simpler explanation for everything. Idealism, if we can kind of wrap our mind around it, which is not so easy, because it's not only that it transcends physics in terms of space, but also time. So we're talking about non-locality in space and time. The moment that you start thinking of it in those terms, like the somehow consciousness gives rise to the physical thing we call the brain inside our head. That means some aspects of brain processing, which we're pretty sure happens, is non-local. That means most of the time, my local senses from my own body are feeding information to my brain, so it gives me the sense of locality. I'm here right now. And we're constantly being reminded by our experience that that is the case. That's why our present embodiment is so overwhelmingly self-evident. Except if you had something like a telepathic experience, or you had a precognitive dream, or you had something else like that, you suddenly get this strange sense that I'm more than simply right here. I'm also extended somehow through space and time, and even into somebody else's mind occasionally. Well, those phenomena are pretty common. A lot of people report them. They've been dismissed by science, mainly because up until recently, we didn't have any model at all that would explain how that could be. So the model we're talking about now is some aspects of the brain are actually quantum in nature and are spread out through space and time. So while most of the time I'm seeing what's here and now, I also have the capacity to pay attention to there and then. And when I do that, that's psychic, that's magic, that's what it is.
Do you have examples of really, powerful, maybe not studies, but kind of anything you've done in research that's showed that some of these psychic abilities do happen, that they are real?
You want me to describe one of the experiments that we do?
I think so. Yeah, maybe one of those that would be the most. I think it's easy for people to pass this type of stuff off. So I know you're very diligent with your research and everything you do. You try to cover all your bases. So something that you would say covers all the bases for somebody who's extremely skeptical it's just obvious that this result was what it was.
Well, so the easy way to explain this then is to go back to what people experience, because all of the experiments that we do, almost all, are ultimately motivated by things that people describe. So a thing that people describe often is that they drive to work and they've gone the same way 1,000 times before, and they know that they're going to get to an intersection which is quite busy. And if they see a green light at the intersection, they normally accelerate a little bit because they want to make it through the light. And today they go to that intersection and they get a very strange feeling about it. They think that you have a green light and there doesn't look like that there's that much traffic, but it doesn't feel right somehow. And you don't even know why. So you begin to slow down. And now people behind you are driving are confused. Like, why are you slowing down? You have a green light. The closer you get to the light, the worse it feels. So you slow down almost to a stop. And as you begin to enter the intersection, boom, a car jams through the red light and would have hit you sideways or broadside. And it could have been a very serious accident. And so you suddenly realize at that point that the bad feeling you had something to do with this future moment of shock. And so that's like rippled backwards in time. Now, in the real world, it's very difficult to know. Maybe it was peripheral vision, maybe you saw something, maybe you heard something, and that's what gave you a clue. But what we can do then, and we've done, we go into the laboratory and we create a simulation of that experience. The way to do it, the easy way to do it without putting somebody in actual danger, the way that we've done it is to use a very standard psychophysiology experiment. You sit somebody down in front of a computer screen, you wire them up to look at how their skin conductance, their heart rate, their pupil dilation, all of these physiological measures that are used also in lie detectors because they're reflections of what's going on in your unconscious. So you measure those continuously, and then you ask the person in the experiment, now press a button, and what's going to happen is 5 seconds, there'll be nothing on the screen, and then suddenly a random selection of a large pool of pictures will be selected and then shown on the screen for 3 seconds. It could be very calm, like a picture of a placid lake. It could be very emotional in two directions. It might be an explosion of some type, which is negative, or a smiling baby, which is positive. So 3 types of images can come up: calm, emotional, and 2 different valences. And then it will go away for about 30 seconds to let you relax from that. And then you'll do this again. You might do it 30 or 40 times in one sitting. So it's an experiment that takes maybe 20 minutes. And then you bring in somebody else and they do it. And you keep doing it again and again, each person getting a random sequence. In fact, to make it really rigorous, you use something like a true random number generator, which is not an algorithm. It's looking at radioactive decay or some other quantum property. So nobody knows in advance which picture is going to be selected from the large pool of pictures. And you do that selection immediately before it shows up. So it's not when you press the button, it's 5 seconds later, then a random decision is made. So during that 5-second period, there is no future picture yet because it hasn't been selected by anything. Nobody knows what it is. You do that experiment many times, and the hypothesis is that if some aspect of our awareness is actually spread out through time, then before a very emotional picture, maybe we'll begin to detect that the body becomes emotionally aroused. And before a calm picture, it won't. And so it's a very straightforward experiment. You do that many, many times with lots and lots of people, and you look to see if there's a difference that happens before the picture is selected. And it turns out that there is a difference. So I've done many experiments like that. I did the first one in 1996. And I remember that one of my colleagues said, "That's stupid. That's way too good, the results that you're getting. I don't believe it," which is exactly what a good scientist will say. Went back to his lab, tried it, and got the same result. So way back from the mid-90s through now, there's like 48 or 50 experiments that have been done in multiple labs around the world. And we all see the same kind of result. It's a statistical result in that it doesn't happen every single time that you like just before some pictures, maybe you weren't paying attention. Maybe it's a picture where you're a herpetologist and you love snakes. Well, so for a person who doesn't like snakes, they're going to have a huge emotional reaction to it. For a herpetologist, they'll look at it and say, "Oh, I know what that is," with no emotion at all. So there's going to be variability in terms of how people react to the different stimuli. So you have to rely on statistics of a lot of people doing a lot of trials. So again, we see repeated effects in multiple laboratories and meta-analyses that collapse all of these studies into one gigantic study show there's no doubt at all from a statistical perspective that that is a real thing. People become aroused seconds before a randomly selected picture than they do before a calm picture. So that's the experiment. After a while, one of my colleagues said, this is so similar to standard experiments in psychophysiology, but those experiments, of which thousands have been published, what they're interested in is what happens when you see a stimulus, what is the reaction to the stimulus? So they're looking at not before the stimulus, but what happened after the stimulus. And so there's a huge amount that's known about how people respond to different kinds of images and pictures and stuff. So they said, well, maybe we could find data from one of those experiments that was conducted for conventional reasons, but just look before the picture showed up to see whether in an experiment conducted the same way as yours, they're seeing the same results, but they just never looked at it before. So he was successful in finding such experiments and the data. And sure enough, this effect that we call presentiment showed up in that data too, which means this is not just magically showing up in the experiments that we ran, but they're showing up in other people's experiments, but they hadn't bothered to look to see whether it was there. And it turns out that this is another colleague did the same thing, and again found in conventional data that this presentiment effect showed up as well. So it shows up at different timescales for different physiological measures. So I originally started using skin conductance because it's really easy to measure, and takes about 1.5 seconds after you see something to reach a peak on your skin conductance effect, which is basically sweat in your palms, and then about another 1.5 seconds before it goes away. So roughly a 3-second, from the moment you see something, about 3 seconds to see this response. The presponse, the presentiment response, is also 3 seconds. It starts about 3 seconds before, it peaks about 1.5 seconds before the stimulus, and then it dies down, and then you see the stimulus, and you get a response in your future. So a colleague looked at this and said, you know what, that looks like time symmetry. And time symmetry in physics is that at a very elementary level, when you look at the equations of how things work down, especially in the quantum world, you can't tell which direction in time something is happening because the direction of time doesn't come into play in the equations. So you can predict from that something happened, it will ripple in both directions in time. You almost always pay attention to the one going forward in time, but even from a quantum perspective, there's stuff happening going backwards in time too. That seems to be what we're seeing though, but at a macroscopic level in human physiology. So
essentially there's a ton of statistical data that's showing we have much more awareness around us, about us.
Through time.
And
to go back now from, yes, in the laboratory, highly controlled conditions, lots and lots of data, we can make a conclusion based on the statistics. But the real life episodes are ones like you're going to get hit broadside, and some part of you feels that, and you just narrowly escape it.
Oh, yeah.
So that's how we translate experience that otherwise may be difficult to understand into the laboratory, where we end up with weaker effects because we can't produce the same level of threat. And a lot of these, they're not all, but a lot of them are related to huge emotional or motivational effects in the world. That's where we begin to experience this stuff. And so we can only simulate that in the lab.
Well, and that's what's so challenging about this, because you really cannot recreate that kind of experience. I mean, for example, my mom was, she was years ago driving, somebody else was driving her car, driving way too fast. And then she had this sense about her. She's like, I need to put on my seatbelt, because it was like not a good, like it was not terrible, but she was kind of feeling like, and then in that moment, she just was like, put on your seatbelt. And she puts on her seatbelt, and within like 5 seconds, a deer ran in front of their car, and they hit this deer and it totaled the car. And I remember her telling me about this. My mom had like 9,000 lives. These things would happen to her all the time. But I remember her telling me about it, and it just made a lot of sense to me. That, I don't know, I think we disregard that kind of stuff just because we can't essentially recreate it in the same exact way. But science will, if we do it on the micro level, we are still getting the same result. It's just on the micro level.
Yeah, real life is spontaneous, right? I mean, it's hard to plan those kinds of episodes, but in the lab we can. And of course, every time we do an experiment, we need to get approval from our ethics board, because any experiment involving people has to pass certain hoops to make sure that you're not damaging people or creating trauma and that sort of thing.
So I'm curious what your take is on the very popular now term frequencies. And I'll explain it from the way I'm looking at it. I started looking at emotions a little bit more in terms of frequencies years ago. And I'm not dogmatic about it, right? I'm not saying that's the way it is. But in terms of like a frequency scale, I started to pay attention to like thoughts as being kind of a frequency where you can sort of elevate or, diminish various frequencies in terms of what you choose to pay attention to, but then also what you choose to practice. Practice is almost like practicing a frequency, AKA an emotion, made it easier for me to access that emotion more readily. And you hear those things like birds of a feather flock together, or like attracts like, or, how we connect with each other on cell phones, those types of things. Do you think that there's any, I guess what's your take on frequencies and how it relates to our consciousness?
Well, this is similar to a question I get sometimes about how to energy. People will talk about energy and resonance and terms that an engineer or a physicist has a very precise meaning for. What we're talking about here is the human experience of something that feels energetic. It's like a felt sense. Or something that feels vibratory, which is where terms like frequency come from. So it's hard to translate because talking about frequency as something that is literally a vibration, you might feel it as a vibration, but it doesn't have the same meaning as what a physicist is going to talk about as a vibration, like a vibrating string. Psychologically, it makes sense because we can feel that if we shift into a certain frequency, like tuning a radio or something, that's more of a psychological way of thinking about what's going on. And it's perfectly valid as a metaphor for that. And I feel I'm vibrating in a certain way, that I will be associated with a certain emotion. So that makes perfect sense. But again, the language, it doesn't always work that well when trying to translate it back into is this like a scientifically valid way of thinking about things? Vibrations and energies and that sort of thing? I would say yes, as an analogy or perhaps a metaphor. As literal, probably not. We need other words that would be able to describe what is actually meant, like what is subjectively meant by shifting into a different frequency. And it's true, I hear it all the time as well. And when I put on my physics hat, it's a little bit annoying because I'm thinking, well, what are they talking about? It's what kind of frequency is there? Well, a body has all kinds of actual frequencies that you can measure. Brain waves are different frequencies. But I think in this case, it's more like a felt sense. It's words that we apply that make sense to the subjective experience, but maybe not so much to what you would measure with an instrument.
Yeah, I think about it in terms of like the awareness through time kind of thing. Like if you feel, let's say you feel weird about a person, and you just kind of pick up on that. I think of that as a vibration or a frequency that I'm picking up on. And the classic thing is like they had a good vibe or a bad vibe, people say, right? Is that an incorrect way through physics to look at that based on consciousness and all what you're researching?
Oh, one of my colleagues at work at the Institute of Noetic Sciences wrote a whole book about vibes. And so from an experiential point of view, absolutely people can feel vibes about other people, about locations, all kinds of interesting things. Is it the same as what a physicist would say is a vibratory rate or a frequency, like an energetic frequency? I doubt it. But again, it's the same issue then about the language that we have is not always adequate to explain what is going on a subjective scale. That's the same issue than saying, well, is your sense of internal subjectivity this being given rise by your brain? Well, probably not. Or at least there's a fair amount of evidence suggesting that the answer is no, it's something more than that, but we don't have the language yet to describe it. And so this is not too surprising because a lot of language comes about from the everyday world. It's our interaction with objects and things in the everyday world. Now we're talking about something where we don't have a good language for yet. Like we can describe our experiences and feelings. We don't know yet how to translate that into a scientifically precise language. That doesn't discount that people feel vibes. It's quite real. Just like when I taste a lemon, I have a certain feeling about what that's like. And so I watch people in these competitions where they eat different peppers of different heat. And of course, if I eat just even the tiniest bit of pepper, I'm allergic to some of them. So I can't eat hardly anything like that. And I'm astonished that somebody can eat a pepper which has these heat ratings that are through the moon, and it doesn't kill them. They may not like it very much, but they,
They
they turn
survive.
beet red in the process.
Hmm.
Well, that would have killed me to eat that pepper. So our subjective experience is very, very different from one person to the next, and our way of expressing it is very different as well. So is a pepper literally hot? No. The way we respond to it, it creates vasodilation, which is why we turn red. So it is hot in that sense, but it's not really hot. It's just the way that we talk about certain kinds of spices make us feel hot. Well, that's different than the heat you would measure with a thermometer.
Right. It's a subjective thing. So let's say from a subjective standpoint, in your work, I mean, you have to be somewhat, you're clearly very much a deep thinker, of course, right? Like you've gone through life, you've experienced, I'm sure, hardships and ups and all the things that come with life. Have you learned anything for like yourself that has come from your research that has helped you live a better life? You know, maybe some kind of, I don't know, some sort of like universal laws that you feel like exist, that if you follow them, they do better? Or does that not exist? Is that just something that people like to say? You know, some kind of thing with intention that you found helps you live a better life, or you see other people. You know what I mean? Is there something that you've learned?
I'm not sure I've learned something that is like a life lesson, other than as most young people, they going through school or even not in school, wondering like what should I be? Well, first of all, for any child who is wondering about that, like what's my profession going to be? What do I end up doing? That's a luxury. And it's a fairly recent luxury in history that most people didn't have any choice at all about what they're going to be. They were whatever their family did. That's the way it was. So if we're fortunate enough to be able to choose what it is that we do, then the advice that I heard, which was actually important for me, was something that Joseph Campbell, the mythologist, said. So, because he was asked too by students, like, what should I study? What should I do? The answer was always the same. It's to follow your bliss. That means find out what you're passionate about, whatever that happens to be, and then figure out a way of making a living following your passion. So I learned when I was a teenager, after reading way too much science fiction and fairy tales, that I was just fascinated with this idea that we are more than it appears that we are, and primarily in a mental sense. I always had this underlying sense that the mind is way more mysterious than we give it credit. And there's many, many things out that are suggested in sometimes in science fiction, but more often in fairy tales, that says there's more to us. It's something bigger than us. I don't come from any religious background at all, and I'm not a religious person. But I would say that after doing studying these kinds of phenomena from a scientific perspective for a long time, that I would say I am spiritual without being religious. That it pushes me in the direction of what people would say is spiritual, only in the sense that we're way more than the everyday life. We have larger capacity. We're different in somehow, and that our consciousness is probably far more important than the way it's typically portrayed in books. Not so much in the spiritual traditions. Spiritual traditions haven't really spent that much time thinking about consciousness per se, unless you twist the language a little bit and you can reinterpret it in a sense, more philosophical sense, kind of along the lines more of what Eastern religions do than Western religions, which is why, among other reasons, why meditation as a practice is so important in these realms, because it allows you to dive deeper and deeper into that subjective side of yourself. If you dive deep enough, you discover, as you would with psychedelics as well, that the world is way more complex and interesting than it is in the everyday sense.
Yeah, it is. I came to find when it was funny when I stopped drinking, actually, is when I sort of had this realization of everything you're talking about. No hate on people who drink, but for me, I recognized quickly that it was like the world was so interesting and I just wasn't seeing it really, given just, just the cultural norms that I was in.
Well, yeah, alcohol is a sedative, essentially, right? It tamps everything down.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, the world is just so fascinating. We look at what the government has even used. What is it? It's not a site, remote viewing for plenty of what they've been working on, which is, crazy things that we'll never know about. But I mean, that's stuff that has even been validated through time of like the government using remote viewing to get intel and other versions of that you talked about in your book. This isn't Harry Potter kind of stuff, although I'm probably the biggest Harry Potter fan ever. I love it. But it's as close as you can get with it still being somewhat tangible. And we can talk about it now with science backing this. I mean, with these psychics, with the people that you've studied in that regard, well, I should even say this too. You had this really fascinating study in your book where you had people bless tea and bless chocolate. And I can't remember exactly so forgive me if I mess some of this up, but the exact intentions behind it. But it was like to make people bless it so they would maybe see if they're going to turn out in a better mood or not. Right. And so the tea or the chocolate that was blessed by people, unbeknownst to those consuming the tea, they had the group that was control group that did not have the blessed tea. And then there was a group that did have the blessed tea, and the group that had the blessed tea reported better moods over time, simply because other people put positive intentions into that tea. Right.
Yeah. In that case, the case of tea, it was Buddhist monks who impressed the water that was used to make the tea with positive mood. And the other thing we did in that experiment is that we don't really understand yet, first of all, what happened. Like, how did that happen mechanistically? We don't know yet. But because when the study of intention is that this water, or actually this tea in that case, will be changed in some way. It'll be blessed so that people will report better mood using a standardized mood reporting scale. But that tea over there, which is made from the same batch, does not get this blessing. And so we had to describe this to the monks about what they were going to do, because it's a little bit strange.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, we created the two teas with one blessed and one not blessed. And then under double-blind conditions, where the people getting the tea obviously could not know which tea they got. So they filled out the mood questionnaires under blind conditions. And then the data was given to the analyst also blind. So they didn't know which was which. And the results turned out the way they did. So there's a significant difference in reported mood. And we did the same thing with pieces of chocolate, and then later with cell cultures and with plant growth and a few other things, and consistently see a very similar result, that blessing water, which is either used to grow plants or grow cell cultures or make tea, depending on the nature of the blessing, that's how people respond to it, and that's how plants and cells respond to it.
It's so incredible. It's like those studies that were done a while ago. I don't know who did them. You might know, but they spoke poorly or lovingly to plants and to water. And it changed the molecular structure and the way that it looked, I believe. Is that right?
Right. Yeah, that was Dr. Emoto's work. And thinking nice thoughts and thinking bad thoughts about water, and then crystallizing the water by freezing it and looking at the shape of the crystals. So we did 2 experiments under double-blind conditions with Dr. Emoto, where we did the intentional imprinting, or we had the water in our lab, and then we sent samples to him, again blinded, so he didn't know which sample had been blessed essentially and which had not. And then his technician created the crystals. We had people evaluate the crystals, and then the blind was broken to see whether or not the results were in the direction he predicted, and they were. So we did a double-blind experiment, and then later we did a triple-blind experiment. And each time you do a blinding, you're preventing people from knowing some aspect of the study. And it confirmed what he had reported. Now, the way he reported the results was extremely beautiful crystals that receive loving thoughts, and then sort of ugly looking crystals or no crystals at all when there were bad thoughts. And what we found again was a statistical effect. We saw statistically these were better looking crystals, as judged by a lot of people, than these crystals, even though they were judging under double-blind conditions. So it's as typically happens when you do a very rigorous scientific experiment, especially in a multiple blinded experiment, the results are nowhere as strong as they are when they're simply reported anecdotally, which is what Dr. Emoto was doing, but it's still real. And so I'm interested in what's real. I don't really care how large the magnitude of the effect is. It's more exciting if it's a big thing, but even if it's a very small thing and we have high confidence that it's real, that maintains my interest.
Yeah, same. So, okay, for the average person, like hearing this, like people have psychic abilities potentially, people are potentially telepathic, all these cool sounding things that everybody wishes they could do. I know that you don't have the answers for all of it, but you're kind of on that leading edge with all of the people who are researching this. Is there something that the average person can do to open their mind, to allow the messages to come through if this is real, allow more access to feeling those feelings or getting those downloads or whatever somebody wants to use the terminology of? What do you think makes sense? Is it intention, positive thinking, meditation? Is it all of it? Like what makes sense for that person?
Well, number one is a dream journal. So a lot of these experiences come through dreams. So the moment you wake up, scribble down a little bit about the dream to help you remember what it is. And then just track how the dreams correspond to the rest of your day, or sometimes even longer than a day. Some dreams you will notice are more vivid than others, or more memorable in some way. Those are especially important to notice because they're vivid for some reason. Something internally is reminding you to pay attention to this. So you might get a very vivid dream because you saw a horror movie or because you had a bad burrito, but not always. I mean, keep track of those things too. The other method, meditation, doesn't have to be anything complex. There's a gazillion apps and YouTubes and so on that teach how to do meditation and guide you through it. So some people are very adept at that and get very deep very quickly. And that is strongly associated with the spontaneous appearance of the different kinds of psychic effects, most often synchronicities from meditation. The other one, which I can't really recommend, but I can just say that historically psychedelics will do this too. Some psychedelics, people respond very differently to psychedelics, which is why it's not a good idea to recommend them. But what I've noticed is that oftentimes I'm contacted by somebody who's an academic or a technical person who has taken a psychedelic, or sometimes more, and they become extremely interested in the kind of research that I'm doing because they then have those personal experiences. And they will describe these experiences as there's like a step function that happens. Beforehand, they're thinking all this stuff is nonsense. It's Harry Potter, and people are sort of imagining it. Then they do something, they have a meditative experience or psychedelic or something. They go through a step function in that they are no longer the same person afterwards because now they have a direct personal experience, oftentimes does open their awareness. And a lot of this is blocked by belief. So if you're thinking all along here, I'm a skeptic. I don't believe in any of this nonsense. There's no evidence, all the rest of it. You won't have those experiences because you can block it. Because just from a purely psychological perspective, we're very, very adept at adjusting what we allow ourselves to experience. Whereas if you are forced to have an experience, whether it's psychedelics or a crisis of some time will also do it. If you're forced to have the experience or you just spontaneously have it, your belief is chipped away. And that allows you to be able to see and experience things that otherwise were always there, but just never paid any attention to it. And so one of the things that we learned then from the laboratory studies is that virtually everyone does have these experiences. For most people, most of the time, it's unconscious. That's why we can do this study like presentiment. We're measuring unconscious bodily responses, and we see the results. Your body knew. Well, it didn't bubble up to your conscious mind. But people who are more aware of what's going on in their body, this is a term called interoception. If you sit quietly and you see if you can sense your heartbeat while you're sitting. So people who are really adept at that, I can do it very easily. It's called very high interoception. You can sort of sense what's going on inside your body. So it's like you're living with a built-in lie detector because you're sensitive to the unconscious in that way. Those people trained to do day trading. These were students in not an experiment, but a kind of quasi-experiment done at a school in London where people are being trained to be a day trader. They also measured how good they were at interoception, just as a secondary measure. And it turned out that the students which were by far the best in doing day trading had much higher interoception than the ones who did not. So it's as though you're doing day trading, a lot of it's like coin flipping, especially if you're trading futures. It's like flipping a coin. You don't know. Nobody knows in advance. That's the fun of doing day trading for futures anyway. Well, the ones who are really, really good at it get this intuitive sense that I think that's going to go in the right direction. Those are the ones who had better interoception, which means they had better contact with their unconscious. And that's where these phenomena live most of the time.
Wow. And I imagine you probably don't drink alcohol much or caffeine or any of that too much. Yeah. Most people in your field of work I've discovered don't. So, amazing. Well, I appreciate your time. Thank you so much. I'm going to attach your link to your book below. Again, I'll say it again. That was probably one of the best books I've ever read. It was incredible. Audiobook was great too. And you have a new book coming out. Where can people find your book and what is it about? And, give us a little, premiere of it, if you wouldn't mind here.
Well, Real Magic came out in 2018. My new book is called The Science of Magic, which comes out in October of 2025. And so in the intervening time, what I've been tracking since 2018 till now is a change within mainstream science where thought leaders in the neurosciences and physics and other areas of biology are coming to the conclusion that materialism as a way of thinking, as a worldview that encompasses everything, which is how science has generally progressed, is simply inadequate. And the direction that they're saying, well, it's kind of like we need to move into a more comprehensive way of thinking about reality that includes consciousness in a fundamental way. Whether it's purely fundamental or whether it's part of the fabric of reality, we don't know yet. But if you look now at the number of conferences, the number of journals that are devoted to consciousness, the number of meetings and interests, and across the board about the nature of consciousness, it has exploded, even from 2018 until now. And so since I've been tracking that, I decided last year I would write a book to bring all of this up to date. So it's bringing up to date the scientific evidence for psychic phenomena, again, describing how this is complete overlap with magical practices and the magical tradition. So all of that's about half of the book. And then I added a whole another section on the book on how to do magic. And that's because people, after reading the book Real Magic, wanted to know, well, how do I do this stuff? Well, so I spent about a third of the book talking about traditional magical practices, what they entail, like what to do, and then linking it back into what we know from a scientific perspective as to why we could have confidence that some of that will actually work for some people. And again, a lot of it has to do with how open your belief system is. So one way I tried to describe this is we're all trained in a materialistic world and we live in materialism. And we're trained to believe that things like Harry Potter is great for fantasy, but of course that's fantasy. And we're in hard reality now. So how do you get beyond that, which is necessary in order to be able to do magic? Well, it's like going to see a movie about superheroes. If you go in and your skeptical mind is thinking about, well, Superman can't do that. Like nobody can do that. That's impossible. Well, that's not going to be a very fun movie. So when you go into a movie like that, you suspend your disbelief. Well, it's the same in this case. If you want to do magic while doing the magical practice, you suspend your disbelief. You just say, for the next half an hour or whatever it takes for me to do this magical thing, I'm suspending my disbelief and my skepticism, and I'm just going to do it. Go with it. And then after I'm finished with that, okay, I can put on my skeptical hat again and I can just go about my business.
Yeah.
But something like that is necessary in order to be able to open the filters just enough to allow this to happen. And then afterwards, like you're not supposed to dwell on the magic anyway. So afterwards, you close it down again and just, pay attention to what's happening in the world around you, and you'll be surprised.
Yeah, that whole concept of belief. Belief seems to be the center, is like believe it and you'll see it, not see it and believe it, or believe in the invisible. And it's like we're in the middle of this storybook just hearing about this, because every storybook says that. And now potentially our life storybook is actually saying that.
That's right.
It's
right.
quite.
And so people sometimes ask me, do I believe in magic or do I believe in psychic phenomena? My answer is I believe in the data and I believe in experience. That's what I believe in. It's very different than believing like faith, right? Because the question is often asked like, do I believe simply because somebody told me to believe, which is faith? No, I don't believe because of that. I believe in statistics. I believe in data. I believe in experience, mine and other people's experience. That's what I can believe in because it's as palpable as it gets.
Yeah, like you've actually witnessed the results. You're seeing this. You have data to prove this, and I think that's what's also so helpful for so many other to believe. So
here's another reason why follow your bliss is kind of a mantra for me. And so as a teenager, I was already beginning to think that it would be great if you could be a scientist and study this stuff, because how fascinating would that be? There are no jobs in this. This is not part of the academic system. There's like nobody's hiring magicians. Stage magicians maybe, but not real magicians. So I was determined though to say, well, I want to be paid a scientist salary for my whole working career to be able to do this as a scientist. Well, that's what I've done. So do I need a way of demonstrating more what a manifestation is, then figuring out very precisely in a very clear manner exactly what it is that I want to do. And it requires work too. It didn't just fall upon me. I worked hard to get to the point where I'm able to spend my career as a paid scientist to do this.
I mean, there's just so much that I could go into with things that I practice daily that have like truly changed my life too. And it's just, it comes with intention. It comes with focus. Writing is so key because you can't think two things at once if you're writing. You just think about what you're writing. That's it. And you combine that with music. In my experience, it's just totally like I've gotten the things that I write about. It just keeps happening. And I don't want to say that in an egocentric way. It's just crazy.
No, that's writing magic.
Yeah.
Writing magic has history of thousands of years, goes all the way back to the very first instances of writing in the Sumerian texts, like in cuneiform texts. Like, in fact, if you can read about this from the anthropological and historical perspective, that some of the very earliest writings were writing magic. You write what becomes. And so, yeah, as you said, it's a way of focusing, and a lot of this has to do with the focus.
It's incredible. I mean, crazy synchronicities, things that I want. It's just like pow, 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 pow. And I think it's key to not go into it to try to get it. It's just my imagination starts going is the thing. It's like, maybe, I don't know. Do you think not? Maybe I'm wrong.
Well, it's important once you realize that this stuff is real to not see omens in everything that happens, because it'll drive you crazy.
What do you mean not see omens? Like,
well, so a bird flew by and it was like a crow and it made a funny sound, and now the crow stopped and it's looking at you and you think, oh my God, what is it telling me?
Yeah.
Or you hear an owl, or so, something, anything could become an omen.
Yes.
Especially with animals. And that'll drive you nuts. Because even if it were true, you start to obsess over it, and you don't want to go there.
Yeah, I think what's kind of nice is that at a certain, goes back to my delivery. I think sometimes people who tend to really believe in this stuff, and they are there, they're with you, they have that belief, they are very woo-woo spectrum. And so then they're just like, everything is a point to it. Everything is something that's important that I should, and it's not really grounded.
Right.
And I think that's important. And that's why you are so valuable, though, because you're quite grounded. So you're magic, yet you're real.
Yeah. The most accomplished actual magicians that I know, and I'm plugged into the magician network, real magicians, they're all very well grounded. You would never guess in most cases that they're magicians. They don't have tats and they're not wearing black leather and all of that stuff. They look perfectly normal, but they also, and they typically are very successful at what they do. They just don't advertise it.
They don't talk about it all. Like they're actual magicians.
Yeah.
So they just do the work, but then they're not constantly talking about it all the time.
Well, they know that there's several thousands of years where people like that would get killed. So it's partially that. It is also that part of the sorcery tradition in particular, which is more like it could be male or female, usually male. In the sorcery traditions, the reason that you don't go into the magic is because you don't want other people's intentions interfering with yours. So the analogy here that we use sometimes is you don't want to be doing biology with a dirty test tube, right? You want the intention to be as pristine and focused and clear as you possibly can. The moment anybody else knows what you've done, like what your intention is, their intention can interfere with it. They can cause it to collapse. They can cause it to deflect. They can do all kinds of things, especially if they're thinking, that's stupid. You're stupid. Your idea is stupid. That it's crushing. I mean, not only psychologically, but just the intention itself can be destroyed. So that's why you don't talk about these things.
Like you keep it. That's what I've always done is I just keep these things. I just write them. But like you're saying, other people's intentions can actually override, or is it that feeling that could diminish your own intention? It's the lack of focus.
It's both psychological and I think it's actual magical.
Okay.
Because the moment you begin to entertain the idea that consciousness is fundamental in some way and transcends physicality, everything is interconnected all the time. There is no separation. That's like the key. Separation is an illusion. Separation in space or time, between people, between minds, between anything you can imagine. It's always connected, completely holistic. It doesn't feel that way in an everyday state, but that's the reality. That's how it works. So if you're doing a magical practice, even though other people may not realize that you're doing an intentional work, some aspect of them are being affected. So it's actually quite difficult not to affect other people in some way because of this connection. So you have to be very careful about what you're doing. This is why you read occasionally that people get heavily into magic and they start doing rituals and they start doing. Some percentage of them, 5 to 10%, will go completely psychotic because they'll start to see things happen and it's like running away with them. They don't know, how do I stop this? How do I re-separate from it all? And the truth is you can't. So it's kind of frightening from that perspective. It's all connected all the time. Well, how do I remain, how can I be grounded if everything is interconnected? Well, it's not so easy. It's part of the practice too, is to find ways of at least giving yourself the illusion of separating long enough and grounding long enough. A lot of at the place where I work, every time we have a meeting, we begin with around a 3-minute meditation, a grounding meditation. And part of the practice sometimes is to intentionally imagine that any other influences that have attached to you in some way or that you're interacting with, that just for now you're able to release them so that they're not there. And people who feel that they're being psychically attacked, some of that is psychiatric problems. Some of it is also real. And so that's where this whole idea of psychic self-defense comes from, where you're now aware of full interconnection, but also aware of ways of protecting yourself, which again, all has to do with intention. Simply decide no one is influencing influencing me in a way that I don't want right now. And that works pretty well too.
So I imagine you've been doing that a lot now that you're more, well, you've been public, but even more so now with YouTube and all these, podcasts.
Well, I think about it. And so sometimes if I feel something that doesn't feel like me, and there is no me either, which makes it complex, but yes, then you just simply engage in the ritual, but the ritual could be 5 seconds. It's a matter of being aware of what's going on. Even still, one of the psychic effects that happens to me most often spontaneously is a telesomatic event. So telesomatic is kind of like telepathy, except it means feeling somebody else's pain who's at a distance. So an example of that is I'll get a really bad stomach ache, and then I have to decide, is this me, or is it somebody I know who's having a stomach ache? And so I had an episode like that a couple of months ago where I had this pretty bad stomach ache, and I'm thinking, well, I think I didn't eat anything unusual. What's going on here? A few days later, I learned that a colleague of mine who I'm working with had taken antibiotics and was getting really bad stomach cramps. The moment I heard that, my pain went away because I suddenly realized, oh, it wasn't me after all, right? I'm feeling it because of this interconnection. But when I realized, oh, it wasn't actually me, it allowed me to drop that, and it dropped the worry about it as well. So, yeah.
Wow. That's, the only way I can relate to that, my mom passed away from alcoholism. So it was years of kind of like buildup of just, bad stuff going on in her life. And so she was super unhappy and depressed and all that, but we were really, really close. And I remember like the week that she passed away, I didn't feel like anything. Obviously I missed her, but I didn't feel any like tug at all. Whereas like I felt for years before that, there was this pull of like, I was just constantly thinking about her. And that's normal when somebody's like alive and you care for them, but it was a deeper thing. I just couldn't feel anything. It was like, her relief was like my relief or something. I remember telling my friend about that. And I was like, I can't feel anything. Like, I'm not even sad. I'm just like, I'm neutral and it's just me. It was just kind of a weird feeling to feel. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. That was a connection that had been there for a long time. The connection went away and it feels like something's gone.
Yeah. It was like but her pain wasn't there with me anymore. Her like loneliness, because it wasn't mine. That was the thing. I think I was feeling hers.
Yeah. So no, that is what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
People experience it in different ways. For me, it's usually a localized pain of one place or another. But yeah, people feel it emotionally in all kinds of different ways, psychologically too.
You must be terribly perceptive of things. It's got to drive you crazy somewhat.
It's not something that I learned. I think I came in this way.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, that's why you were pulled to do this work. I think probably. Yeah, that's why you're here. So yeah. Well, I will email you with some follow-ups. Thank you so much, Dean. We'll be in touch, and I hope that I hope you all the best on this mission, and maybe we can talk again once your next book comes out.